In this lesson, we will learn about multiplying decimals by a one-digit number. We're going to start our lesson by multiplying tenths by a whole number. Let's first look at multiplying 2/10 by 4. So there's lots of different ways we can think about that, but the first way we're going to think about this is using a number line. So if we were to start at 0 and move 2/10 for each step, we would land where on the number line after those 4 steps? Well, we can see between 0 and 1, we've divided it into 10 equal parts. Let's just count that so you can see. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We've divided each segment between the whole numbers into 10 equal parts. So if we were going to jump, here's 2/10, and here's another 2/10, here's another 2/10, and our final 2/10. So we've jumped 2/10 4 different times. We would land right here at what you would see as 8/10. We can even count it. Here would be 1/10, 2/10, 3/10, 4/10, 5/10, 6/10, 7/10. Here we are at 8/10. And we can also see that 2/10 plus 2/10 plus 2/10 plus 2/10 equals 8/10. And we would write that 0.8 because the first decimal place after the decimal point is the tenths place. So after 4 steps, you would be at 0.8 or 8/10 on the number line. Now, another way of thinking about this is to use a place value chart to help us see what's happening to each place value as we multiply. So if we have our place value chart here divided into the ones and the tenths, remember the tenths place is the first place value after the decimal point, and we have 4 times 2/10. Well, we can see that in 2/10 we have 0 ones. That's why there's nothing represented in the ones place. And we have 2/10. So we have 1 group of 2/10, 2 groups of 2/10, 3 groups of 2/10, 4 groups of 2/10. And really, when we're multiplying 2/10 times 4, that's what we're saying, 4 groups of 2/10. So that gives us a total of 8/10. So 4 times 0.2, or 4 times 2/10 gives us 8/10. And finally, if we wanted to just multiply the decimal and the whole number using the standard algorithm, we would just line up 0.2 times 4. And so we'd first multiply 4 times 2, which is 8. And 4 times 0 is 0. And we have, we look in the factors to see how many place values are behind the decimal point. Well, there's one place value, or there's one digit behind the decimal point, and that means that in our product, we also need 1 digit behind the decimal point. So our decimal point would go right here when multiplying 0.2 times 4. All right, now that we've looked at multiplying tenths by a whole number, let's look at multiplying decimals with 1 decimal place by a whole number. So instead of 4/10, we now have 2 and 4/10, and we're going to multiply 2 and 4/10 by 3. So we're really taking 3 groups of 2 and 4/10. Now, using a place value chart, if we look at what 3 groups of 2 and 4/10 would look like. So we would have, in our ones place, 3 groups of 2, because there are 2 ones in our decimal. So here's 1 group of 2, 2 groups of 2, 3 groups of 2, and then we would need 3 groups of 4/10. So here's 1 group of 4/10, 2 groups of 4/10, 3 groups of 4/10. So we can kind of see on our place value chart what that looks like. Now, how many total tenths do we have? Well, 3 times 4 is 12, so we're going to have 12 tenths. And you can see that once we reach 10 tenths, we would regroup those 10 tenths to 1 whole. And so we're left with 2 tenths. And when we add 2 ones plus 2 ones plus 2 ones, we get 6 ones. So we have 6 ones plus that one that we regrouped from the 10 tenths. So we are left with 7 ones and 2 tenths. So that would be 7.2. Now let's look at the standard algorithm over on this side, and let's relate it to what we were seeing as we were using the place value chart to help us multiply. So step 1 is to multiply the tenths by 3. So 3 times 4 is 12, and so 1 goes up top, 2 goes down below. Now what's happening here is the 1 that we carried up here was the 10 tenths that we regrouped and regrouped it to 1 whole. And we were left with the 2 tenths right here, and that's how we get the 2 in the 10th place right here. Second step then is to multiply 3 by 2 ones. So 3 times 2 is 6, and then we can't forget to add in that 1 that we regrouped, so we have 7. So 7.2. Now, to know where to put the decimal point, we look at our factors, 2.4 and 3, and we look to see how many digits are behind the decimal point. In this case, we only have 1 digit behind the decimal point in both factors, and so we know that we need to have 1 digit behind the decimal point in our product. So 2.4 times 3 is 7.2. Now let's look at this number line. I want you to study the number line and see what you notice, and see if you can figure out what multiplication problem is being shown on this number line. Just go ahead and look at it, study it, and see what you noticed. You may have noticed that between each whole number is divided into 10 equal parts. You can look at the arrows. Maybe you notice how many tenths they're skip jumping. And did you come up with 2 times 3/10, or 2 groups of 3/10? Essentially, that's what it's showing. Here's 1 group of 3/10, and here's the second group of 3/10. So 2 groups of 3/10. Well, where would you land? If you said 6/10, you are correct. We would land at 6/10. So we would write that 0.6. Let's try another one. Let's look at this number line. Again, just to confirm that between each of the whole numbers, it is divided into 10 equal parts. And now look to see what is being shown with the arrows. How many are in each of those jumps, and how many jumps are being made? Well, it might have been a little hard for you to count, sitting so far away, but if you can see, there are 3 groups of 6/10. Here's one group of 6/10, two groups of 6/10, three groups of 6/10. So 3 groups of 6/10 would be written in a number sentence as 3 times 6/10. Let's look at this on a place value chart to see what this would look like. So in 6/10 we have 0 ones, so no ones are represented on the place value chart. We have 6/10, so we have one group of 6/10, two groups of 6/10, three groups of 6/10, which gives us 18/10, and that's what's represented down here. Now, we know that 10/10 will regroup, and that would become one whole. And then we are left with 8/10, right? So we are left with this remaining 8/10. So we have 8/10 and one whole, and so the product of 3 times 0.6 would be 1.8. And if we look at it in this format, we can say 3 times 6/10 gives me 18/10, which is what we found down here. We regrouped 10 of those tenths, which gave us 1 and 8/10 left. So 1 and 8/10. And finally, if we were going to multiply 6/10 times 3 using our standard algorithm, 3 times 6 is 18. And so we regroup 10 of those tenths and make it into one whole, and we're left with 8/10. So 1/8 or 18. And 3 times 0 is 0 plus the 1 gives us 1. We have one digit behind the decimal point in our factors, and so we need one digit behind the decimal point in our product. So 1.8 is the product. Let's give you a little practice multiplying decimals times a whole number. Copy these 4 problems down, solve them, pause the video while you do your thinking, and then check back to see if your thinking matches mine. Now that we've looked at multiplying tenths by a whole number, let's see how this works when we multiply hundredths by a whole number. So we have a situation here, or a problem here, where it says Karen bought 3 apples at 45 cents each. How much did she pay in all? So we have 3 apples that cost 45 cents each. So that's like saying 3 groups of, remember that's what multiplication means, groups of 45 hundredths. So if we were going to use a place value chart to look at this, okay, we know that we have 3 groups of 45 hundredths. So in 45 hundredths, we have 0 ones. So there's nothing in the ones place. We have 4 tenths. So here's one group of 4 tenths, 2 groups of 4 tenths, 3 groups of 4/10ths, and we have 5/100ths. So we have 1 group of 5/100ths, 2 groups of 5/100ths, 3 groups of 5/100ths. So 3 groups of 5/100ths gives us 15/100ths. And there's our 15/100ths. And 3 groups of 4/10ths gives us 12/10ths. And now you can see we have some regrouping to do, right? Because we have 10/100ths, and those 10/100ths would be regrouped into 1/10. There's my 10th. There we go. And then we can see that we have 10/10ths, and those 10/10ths would be regrouped into 1 whole. So we'll put 1 place value disc in our ones place. So now look, we have 1, 1. We're left with 1, 2, 3 tenths, and we're left with 5/100ths. So it would be 1 and 35/100ths, or 1.35. Now let's relate what we just saw in using our place value chart to the standard algorithm. So if we were to line up 45/100ths times 3, our first step is to multiply 3 times 5. So 3 times 5 is 15. 1 goes up top, the 5 goes down below. And what was happening there was, remember, we regrouped these 10/100ths to become 1/10. That's exactly what happened there. We were left with these 5/10ths down here, and those are the 5/10ths that are sitting right there. Then we would multiply 3 times 4. 3 times 4 is 12, plus 1 is 13. So the 1 would go up top, the 3 would go down below. And what happened there was that 1, 1, and we were left with 3/10ths, tying it back to our place value chart. And then 3 times 0 is 0, plus 1, the one that we regrouped, is right there. Now, we have to look at how many digits are behind the decimal point in our factors. So there's 2 behind the decimal point here. So we're going to need 2 behind the decimal point in our product. So it would be 1.35, or 1 and 35/100ths. Let's look at some examples of multiplying decimals into the hundredths with a whole number. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is to line up 5 and 64/100ths times 6. I really like using graph paper when multiplying, especially with decimals, just because it keeps everything nice and lined up. Now, one thing you might be wondering is, when we're adding and subtracting decimals, we have to be so very careful to line up the decimal points to keep the place values of each of the numbers in line. With multiplying, we don't line up the decimal points to multiply. If we did, it would be 5.64 times 6. That makes no sense, okay? So the decimal points don't need to be lined up when we multiply. So let's look now. 6 times 4 is 24. 2 goes up top, 4 goes down below, 24. 6 times 6 is 36, plus 2 is 38. 3 up top, 8 below, 38. 6 times 5 is 30, plus 3 is 33. Again, you have to look at how many place values are behind the decimal point in each of your factors. And we can see there's 2 behind the decimal point in our first factor. There are no numbers behind the decimal point in our second factor. So we need 2 place values, or 2 digits, behind the decimal point in our product. So we plant our decimal point right there, and it's 33 and 84 hundredths. Now another way you could think through this is you could take 6 groups of 5, 6 groups of 6/10ths, and 6 groups of 4/100ths. We could find each of these totals and then add them together, right? They're each part of the product. So 6 groups of 5 is 30. I'm going to put my decimal point here to keep everything lined up. And 6 groups of 6/10ths would be 36/10ths. Now you might say, oh, 36/10ths. But is that 36/10ths? No, that's 36/100ths. So to write 36/10ths, it's actually 3.6, because 30 of those tenths would be regrouped into 3 ones, and then we'd have 6/10ths. And then 6 groups of 4/100ths gives us 24/100ths. And if we add these together, we're going to get the same product as we would if we just lined it up to multiply. So it's just another option in multiplying decimals. Will you line up and multiply 9 groups of 8 and 36/100ths, or 9 times 8.36? Check back, or pause the video and then check back to see if your thinking matches. Okay, so we have it all lined up. Remember, we don't have to line up the decimal point when we're multiplying. We just write the numbers down. And 9 times 6 is 54. 5 up top, 4 below, 54. 9 times 3 is 27, plus 5, 32. 3 up top, 2 down below, 32. And 9 times 8 is 72, plus 3 is 75. We look in our factors to see how many place values are after the decimal point, and there are 2 in this factor, there are 0 in this factor, so we need to have 2 behind the decimal point in our product. So 75 and 24/100ths, or 75.24. Now we could also multiply by place value, so we know we'd have 9 groups of 8, 9 groups of 3/10ths, and 9 groups of 6/100ths. 9 times 8 is 72. 9 times 3/10ths is 27/10ths, or 2.7. And 9 times 6/100ths is 54/100ths. And if we add those together, we do get the same answer, 75.24. So in this lesson, we learned about multiplying decimals in the tenths and hundredths by one whole number. We looked at how this would be used or figured out using a number line. We've looked at how this would work in using place value, a place value chart to solve, and we also looked at using the standard algorithm.